I had more fun dreaming up the villains than I ever did with the heroes.
In the first X-Men movie, when he's sitting there playing chess against a guy who can read his mind, it's gotta be the stupidest villain in the world.
What supervillain or what bad guy is gonna walk into a maternity ward and actually slaughter babies like the Joker?
They are larger than life, with schemes and plots that seem unrealistic and often insane. And it could be argued they draw their inspiration from one of the most evil men history has ever known.
One of the intriguing things for comic book writers about somebody like Hitler was that he was this incredibly powerful world figure who commanded vast armies and resources, and scientists working on various things like A-bombs and V-2 rockets and so on. He provided the prototype for what would become somebody like Lex Luthor or Brainiac, and on it goes.
Superman can fight someone with the resources of Lex Luthor, or he can fight someone with the power of Doomsday. It's a worthy adversary, and you can't define heroism without villainy. Just the same way you need evil to define good.
Drawing inspiration directly from the World War II era and the dictators that followed, Marvel Comics invented a vile tyrant of their own who has endured for decades.
Dr. Doom is the ruler of a European country. He genuinely believes that he cares for these people that are under his iron-fisted rule and his tyrannical, horrible police state that he keeps them, but they're safe. But they're safe. They don't have to worry about food, they don't have to worry about poverty. They've got Doom. Doom looks over them like a watchful parent looks over their children.
Anytime you have a character who has really no checks and balances, the heroes have to do the right thing for the right reason. The villain is doing whatever he wants to do for whatever reason is on his mind at that particular moment. It's always these grandiose schemes to take over the world or blow up the world or do some kind of huge and terrible damage. And I think that's ultimately why the villains are what really drive the books. They're really what, we love to read about the Fantastic Four, but we're waiting for Dr. Doom to come around the corner and do something nasty.
You can have a great villain. If he doesn't have a real good background story, like Dr. Doom is a great villain, but being the dictator of a foreign country, I mean, that gave him a dimension that's fantastic.
If he did something wrong here in America, he couldn't be arrested because he had diplomatic immunity. And he didn't think of himself as a bad guy. He just wanted to rule the world. And if you really think about it seriously, and I know you will, it isn't a crime. You could go up to a policeman and you could say, "Officer, I want to rule the world." He can't arrest you.
He's by far one of the most famous villains in fiction. Created as a mad scientist, he was a normal human who would constantly oppose and defy the world's greatest hero.
Lex Luthor is one of those characters that's bigger than the comics. Easiest way to put it.
To look at Lex Luthor, his history is kind of complex. For one thing, he was a totally different character when he was first introduced. He was a red-headed arms dealer. And there was another Superman villain who was a bald-headed mad scientist, and he was called the Ultra-Humanite. And somehow, they kind of fused. And it wasn't a story. They didn't actually fuse. It was just the visual and the backstory of the Ultra-Humanite took over the name Lex Luthor.
So Lex started out as a classic mad scientist in the 30s, just typical, Saturday serial type villain. With red hair even back then, with Zeppelins that would attack Metropolis or whatever. Very much in that kind of pulp villain mold.
When I was growing up, every Superman issue would have a Luthor story pretty much, and would always begin with Luthor in his prison grays, Somehow he'd escape, find a giant robot that he had built in his secret laboratory someplace under Metropolis, and attack Superman, and Superman would beat him at the end of it. And I'm going, well, first of all, it's gotta cost a lot more to build a giant robot than whatever he could possibly make from robbing a bank. Secondly, if you're that smart, how do you keep getting caught?
Lex may have started out as a simple mad scientist, but to keep up with the times, he'd have to get a little more complex.
Yeah, you can see the evolution of the villain through Lex Luthor, you know, being the goofy science nerd in the 50s with his weird space suit, always, you know, mad at Superman for making him bald.
In the 40s and 50s, Lex Luthor was a mad scientist because Americans were terrified of science. In the 80s, you know, Americans are very happy with science. There's a tech boom going on. What are they scared of? They're scared of rich people.
When I was relaunching Superman with Man of Steel, the writer who'd been picked for the second chair called me up one day and said, well, I've got this idea for Luthor. What if we turn him into this corporate businessman, this kind of evil Donald Trump?
We turned him into someone smarter, craftier, better in many, many ways. Someone Superman could not fight because he had muscles. And that to me was vitally important, was that he had to be someone that all of Superman's powers were useless against.
Lex Luthor is a classic symbol for greed, self-interest, capitalism run amok. And in that sense, he embodies sort of the negative elements of the American ideal, where Superman is this morally clear, altruistic vision of America. Lex Luthor is what America could be if it overindulges in capitalism and goes down the wrong road.
He's always been about power, and so all of the different guises that he's appeared in, whether he's president or mad scientist or whatever, it's still about power. Luthor wants power.
In the last few years, what are Americans scared of? We are terrified of our government. So Lex Luthor becomes the President of the United States. That's a beautiful allegory right there.
At one time, Lex Luthor owned a kryptonite ring, which he wore to fend off Superman. The kryptonite ring idea backfired and gave Lex cancer, as kryptonite is radioactive. A small detail that seemed to escape the greatest criminal mind of our time. Though he appears as a clown, he is anything but funny. And the line between good and evil is not drawn quite as clearly as you might think. It's the villains that draw us in again and again. The only reason the hero can look so good is because he's up against someone so evil. And the Joker is about as evil as you can get.
The Joker, as a character, I always saw as sort of the ultimate force of chaos. Like, he's pretty much just a homicidal murderer, but on a mass destruction kind of level.
The Joker began as a complete homicidal lunatic in the first story where he appears, really dark, scary character.
The first time that the Joker was ever in a Batman comic, he died at the end. And then the next time they brought him back, the first panel was about how he didn't really die.
By the time the 50s came around, we had a comics code. You weren't really allowed to show scary characters anymore. And the Joker had become a crime clown who drove around in his own Joker-mobile, which looked a bit like the Batmobile. He comes back in the 70s and he starts to murder people again, and then gets increasingly dark through the 80s and the 90s. But how do you explain all these changes? I just thought, okay, that's one guy with 15 personalities. That we've all got these different selves. You know, there's one part of us wants to do this, and one part just wants to get off with a girl, and the other part wants to be nice, and one part wants to do the shopping. There's a lot of different voices, versions of us in there, so I just imagine the Joker being the victim of that.
Like Lex Luthor, the Joker couldn't remain the two-dimensional character that started in the 40s. Lex became an exploration of power, vanity, and greed, while the Joker offered writers and artists the chance to explore madness and the human condition.
I'm certainly not the only one who's played with this idea that, you know, that Batman is the central focus of the Joker's life. It's the focus of all his madness.
The Joker's a chaotic character. I mean, that's what he represents, as opposed to Batman, who's order. Batman comes in and sorts things out and then goes home when the sun comes up. The Joker does the exact same thing but destroys everything, leaves chaos in his wake, kills people for no reason. So he is Batman's, the yin and yang thing with him, so that's why he makes such a good character with Batman.
The Joker is, I think, the greatest trickster villain in all of pop culture, maybe in all of culture, period, because he isn't motivated. He is a trickster. You just never know. You look at him sideways and he might kill you or he might give you $1,000.
I don't know if I 100% agree with Denny O'Neill's interpretation of the Joker, but I have to agree with the logic of it. The logic of it is, this guy's this close to being insane. I don't know how you can, you can't slide a piece of paper between the difference of insanity and sanity with the Joker. He's crazed, and he acts crazed, and he is crazed.
I always kind of saw him, it's like that Alan Moore story, The Killing Joke, where, the difference between the Joker and Batman was just how they reacted to one bad day. I always saw that as the real reason why they are kind of the flip side to each other. Batman is the controlled version of what you do with the chaos of the world destroying your life, whereas the Joker is almost the more reasonable response to it, which is to actually go crazy.
I don't agree with the characterization of the Joker as insane. I think he's like Hamlet. He sometimes chooses to put an antic disposition on. I don't think a truly insane villain would last 5 minutes against Batman.
Well, I think the Joker is a great character. He's a great Batman villain. He just is he's what you think of as pure evil, even though bad things have happened to him and he's bent a certain way. I think that, in my mind, he was headed that way from the beginning.
And he changes constantly to suit the mood of the weather or the news that he's watching or whatever he sees. One day he'd wake up and just think, no, I'm just going to be a clown today and I'll play about with Jack-in-the-Boxes and frighten people with toys, and then the next day he gets up and goes, no, I'm going to kill everyone. That was my take, and I've been using it ever since.
According to Bob Kane, the look of the Joker was decided when writer Bill Finger showed him a picture of Conrad Veidt's horrific grinning appearance in the 1928 film The Man Who Laughs. The Joker and Lex Luthor changed to keep up with the times. But Marvel Comics not only gave their characters depth, they questioned what heroes and villains really were.
Marvel Comics does that better than anybody else in the history of the medium, is giving you the villain who believes in his own mind that he's the hero. We're all the hero in our own story. And the villains are of no different stripe.
What we've seen in the last 15 or 20 years with this change toward everybody wondering if they're morally justified or not is a shift toward villains who might be in the right and heroes who might be in the wrong, and an awful lot of gray area between them.
One of the best examples of a sympathetic or even noble villain is a man the X-Men have clashed with time and time again, Magneto.
Magneto genuinely believes that if he does not organize the mutants of the world against Homo sapiens, then they will become an extinct species.
The X-Men are mutants who are superior, Homo superior, to regular people. If you think of it realistically, it's spooky. You have a child who can do things like light on fire and fly through the air. I mean, isn't that the future of the human race? All these strange mutants, us, we're the Neanderthals in the caves. And so if you look at Magneto, you kind of go, well, is he wrong? If evolution takes place, regular human beings are basically going to either be killed off or die off. That's a tough one.
He feels that there's a war between mutants and humans, and that it's racism, and that they're trying to kill us, and that they want us to go away because they know we're the next species. They know we're going to take over, and they're trying to hold on to their lifestyle for as long as they can, and they will kill us to do it. Is an argument that you can go, well, you got a point.
Magneto wants to end humanity, but at the same time, he has a very valid reason for wanting to do so. So it's this tremendous paradox that these texts create, where you're wanting the villain to fail, of course, but in a really, really weird way, you're rooting for him to succeed. That duality makes it a really intense experience to read X-Men comics and to sympathize with Magneto.
Some people can call Magneto a noble villain. I wouldn't. I go back to the Magneto that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created, and the Magneto that I worked with on the X-Men days, who hadn't been retconned into being a Jewish freedom fighter. Magneto was one of the later bad guys when Stan and Jack created him, and he was more of a bad guy because he was a bad guy. He wanted to take over the world. He wanted to suppress or even wipe out humankind so that the mutants can take over. And the X-Men are kind of standing there going, excuse me? As one of the wives of one of the editors up at Marvel said when they retconned in all the stuff about him being a Holocaust survivor, she said, you know, Holocaust survivor is the origin of a hero, not the origin of a villain. And it kind of makes the X-Men bad if they fight him, which is not really where you want to go. I mean, you gotta have, he's a bad guy.
X-Men is all about this sort of racial metaphor. There's a lot of Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X at play in the text. And certainly a lot of the Holocaust appears in there as well, in terms of the relationship between the mutants and the greater society as a whole. And God loves, man kills. So Magneto is consistent with this theme that X-Men establishes with regard to race. And it makes him genuinely terrifying because he's not wrong. He's just misguided.
The best villains are the ones whose methods are suspect, but their motives are, you know, perfectly understandable.
He's justified in a lot of ways, and that's what makes him scarier as a villain. He has a reason to hate, but at the same time, he has given in to hate, and therefore he has to be defeated.
Marvel's is the telling of some of the most iconic moments in Marvel comic history, as seen through the eyes of a photojournalist and everyman, Phil Sheldon. Issue 4 tells the story of the death of Spider-Man's first love interest, Gwen Stacy, as foreshadowed on its ominous cover. With the right motivation, the most foolish character can turn into a force to be reckoned with. Find out more when we return. From mad scientist to flat-out madman and everything in between. Here's some light reading on some very dark characters. This is Comics 101. It's said that there is no honor among thieves, and Villains United proves it. A prelude to DC Comics' Infinite Crisis, writer Gail Simone's 2005 miniseries examines the treachery, violence, and betrayal that takes place between characters that view life only in shades of black and gray. Going Sane is a 4-part Batman, Legends of the Dark Knight series that examines the yin-yang relationship between Batman and his nemesis, the Joker. Thinking he's finally eliminated his archenemy, the Joker does the unexpected and snaps back to sanity. Author Alan Moore delivers a dark and detailed meditation on the identity and motivation of Jack the Ripper in 1888 London. This tour de force of research mixed with speculation is named for the From Hell letter, an actual note delivered with a kidney that many believe to be an authentic message from the killer himself. Comic book villains don't always start out strong. Sometimes it's quite obvious that they were thrown together at the last minute. But making a character great isn't always about how you start out. Sometimes it's about how you end up.
Kraven's Last Hunt was the darkest Spider-Man story that had ever been done. My view of Kraven absolutely changed because going into it, I didn't really know what I was going to do with the character. Kraven was like a joke at that point. He was just this goofy guy, you know?
He's clearly based upon 1950s films about hunting the most dangerous prey, man. Easily defeated, of course. As he gets more complicated and he starts to have this tremendous sense of honor and this moral code, and he's genuinely regarding Spider-Man as this worthy adversary. He does a lot of heroic things in terms of keeping things fair. He doesn't want to just kill Spider-Man in his sleep. He wants to defeat him.
And I just asked why? Why is he who he is? What drove him to this? And suddenly, there was this amazing character. He was slightly mad, and Spider-Man had not become Spider-Man, but he'd sort of become this symbol of all the angst in his life, all the torment, all the drama, and he came from Russian nobility, but he came from the jungle, and all the duality, all the Dostoevskian duality that was tearing him apart, all became focused on Spider-Man. And I really stripped his character down, so he decides, this is it. I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna get him this time. And Kraven traps him, and he has him with the rifle. He's got him lined up in the rifle sights. And Spider-Man's thinking the whole time, all right, I know, I've been through this a few hundred times, you know. They trap you, then they take you off somewhere, and they put you in a death trap, and they talk to you for 20 minutes, and then I find a way to escape. But instead, Kraven just points the gun, pulls the trigger, and that's the end of the first part, because we think he's dead. And as far as the readers know, he is dead because they bury him. The last scene in the first part is Spider-Man is buried.
It turns out he doesn't kill Spider-Man, of course, but he does the next best thing, which is to tranquilize him and bury him, and then take over his job. He essentially dresses as Spider-Man for a while and does some of his work. So he's bested him in all the ways that one human can best another.
Defeating Spider-Man in battle isn't necessarily enough of defeating Spider-Man for Kraven. He has to become him and prove that he can do Spider-Man's job as well, if not better, than Spider-Man. So in this sense, he's not just challenging Spider-Man, the character, he's challenging everything Spider-Man represents and demonstrating that what he is, or what he represents, is bigger, harder, more difficult, or somehow superior to Spider-Man. And of course, in the end, it turns out that it's really not that way.
And by doing that, we get to contrast Kraven's view of what it is to be heroic, which is incredibly brutal, versus Peter Parker, who is essentially, despite the fact that he flies around in webs and punches people in the face, is one of the most decent, compassionate humans in all the comic book universes, you know? So we have this whole scene where finally Peter comes awake and crawls out of the grave after he goes through this whole sort of inner struggle and realizes that weeks of his life have been completely robbed from him. His wife doesn't know where he is. There's this lunatic out there in a Spider-Man suit, you know, doing all these insane things in his name, which brings them to the final confrontation between the two of them. Kraven, there's no mustache twirling, there's no nyahaha, I'll get you next time. He feels complete. He just thinks, I've done what I wanted to do, I killed him. But what fun is it killing somebody if you can't like resurrect them and have them know that you defeated them? I have defeated him completely, my life is complete. And he walks into the other room and he takes his rifle and he puts it in his mouth and he blows his brains out. And really, Kraven's ultimate act, even though he thinks he's doing something wonderful, by completing himself with this suicide, a la Ernest Hemingway, you know, his final act is an act of cowardice. All of a sudden, people are like, don't kill Kraven, you know, whereas 6 months before, it would have been, kill Kraven. And you can do that, I think, with any character. As a writer, you never view them as a villain. You view them as this poor, tortured, tormented soul, you know? So my journey was one of ever-deepening compassion for the character.
Comic books are associated with the superhero, but deep down, we know we read them for the villains, too. After all, how great is a hero if no one opposes him? And how can he be heroic if there's no one out there making trouble?